Vladimir Putin. Who is he in the eyes of Donald Trump, really? A rival, a friend, or an unpredictable political chess master? An unexpected conversation between Donald Trump and his son Barron has unveiled revelations never before disclosed. Tense private meetings, sharp remarks, and masterful negotiation tactics hidden behind the stage of global politics. Amid the warm glow of the Mar-a-Lago fireplace, a seemingly simple question unraveled a series of shocking disclosures. But the true climax came when a call from Moscow rang through the room. Was Putin listening to every word they said? Could a historic meeting be on the horizon? If you love gripping political narratives filled with high-stakes drama and raw emotions, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss what comes next. This isn't just a conversation. This is a grand chess game between the present and the future. Under the warm golden light of the crystal chandelier glistening against the high ceiling of the Mar-a-Lago living room, where every detail exudes opulence and power, Barron suddenly posed a question that shifted the atmosphere entirely. What do you think of Vladimir Putin? Donald Trump gently set his glass of orange juice down on the table and took slow, deliberate steps toward his son. That question did not merely summon memories of crucial past meetings. It opened the door to a profound dialogue between two generations, where power, strategy, and true respect intersected. Under the same warm golden glow of the chandelier, beneath which world leaders had once gathered, where political calculations had been shaped over fine wine and the soft tapping of Italian leather shoes, what seemed like a casual conversation between father and son unexpectedly became the focal point of a veiled game of power. And it all began with one simple yet strikingly sharp question. What do you think of Vladimir Putin? Barron did not ask with the curious tone of a child, but with the serious, composed, and contemplative voice of someone seeking to truly understand the world his father had once commanded. He had just returned from university, an iPad in hand, neither rushed nor distracted by the concerns that usually preoccupied young minds. He simply looked at his father, the man who had stood at the center of a global political storm, and asked about a name he knew was not easy to utter unless one was truly ready to listen. Donald Trump at that moment was taking a sip of orange juice. He did not answer right away. The heavy ebony wood glass table bore the weight of the glass he had just set down as he turned to observe his son. Putin, he repeated, as if ensuring he had heard correctly. Then he leaned back into his chair, his thick eyebrows furrowing slightly. A few seconds of silence stretched between them, not empty, but laden with thought. It was the silence of a man who had faced power, measured the breadth of a formidable opponent, and was now choosing how to share that knowledge with his son, the one who might someday step into the game himself. Putin is a remarkable man, son. Very remarkable. His voice was steady, unembellished, yet weighted with significance. These were not words drawn from books, nor from public statements. They came from first-hand experience, from cold handshakes, from brief yet pivotal conversations capable of shifting the direction of entire summits. Trump did not speak of Putin as a figure on the evening news. He spoke as someone who had looked into Putin's eyes, who had read the body language of a man who did not need to say much to make an entire room shift with his presence. He doesn't need to shout. He doesn't need to prove anything. He just walks in, and everyone knows he's the one in control. Barron sat still. It wasn't just curiosity in his eyes. It was a deep desire to understand why the man his father called remarkable was indeed so remarkable. His voice was soft but clear as he pressed further. But isn't he hated by many? The media calls him a dictator, dangerous. Trump let out a quiet chuckle, laced with that familiar hint of sarcasm. The media? They hate me more than they hate Putin. He patted his knee, his tone carrying a touch of humor, but maintaining its signature sharpness. People don't hate you because you're wrong. They hate you because you don't kneel, because you're strong, because you don't play by their rules. Barron nodded, though his expression still held uncertainty. So, is he a friend or an enemy of America? The next question wasn't just about Putin anymore. It was about understanding his father. Trump straightened up, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, as if analyzing a chessboard. Not a friend, not exactly an enemy. He's a player, Barron, a damn good one. He does what's best for Russia, and I do what's best for America. Sometimes those align, sometimes they don't. But the most important thing is this: I respect him. A man must know how to respect a worthy opponent. That respect wasn't admiration, it was recognition. The kind of recognition that exists only between those who have faced each other across negotiation tables no one else was allowed to enter. Trump told Barron about the closed-door meetings, Helsinki, Hamburg, Singapore, where he and Putin sat face-to-face. No cameras, no advisors interrupting, just brief conversations, piercing observations, and sometimes warnings concealed beneath cold smiles. Once, Putin had told Trump, "You are strong, but remember the media can eat you alive." And Trump, without hesitation, had replied, "I don't control them. I just have to beat them." It wasn't just a response, it was a test, and Putin had nodded. As Barron listened, there was no hiding the admiration in his eyes, but he was also beginning to understand. Strength alone wasn't enough to survive in that world. It took clarity, composure, and a cold, calculated strategy. Trump looked at his son as if he had just shared a family secret. Putin doesn't trust easily. He controls everything. That's his strength and his weakness. Because in the end, you need someone by your side. A great man cannot stand alone forever. At that moment, Barron was no longer just a listener. He was thinking, connecting, wondering if he too might one day step onto that chessboard. He didn't need to answer yet, but his gaze, slow, deep, and sharp, revealed one thing. The seed had been planted. That conversation under the glistening crystal chandelier of Mar-a-Lago wasn't just a recollection of the past. It was the passing of a torch between generations. One man who had walked into the eye of power, and another who was preparing himself to face the storms ahead. And the name Putin, now spoken, was no longer just a question. It was a door, slightly ajar. Donald Trump took another sip of his orange juice as Barron pressed on. "You actually met him?" "Privately, I mean. Not in front of the cameras." The question seemed to unlock a vault of memories, ones Trump had long kept sealed behind his composed exterior. "Many times, Barron, but some meetings never made the news, and those are the ones that shaped what the world will never understand." Trump sat up straight, resting his hands on his knees, as if preparing to step into a game of recollection where he alone knew every move. Helsinki 2018. That summit, it was special. Not because of what the media said, but because of the way he looked at me. Not hesitant, not friendly, just two men measuring each other. Like two alpha wolves. He paused, locking eyes with the son. "Putin never asks directly. He makes you speak first. That's his art." Barron tilted his head slightly. "So what did you say first?" Trump smirked, pride flickering in his eyes. "I told him, Vladimir, if you were on our side, the world would be ours." He just smiled, said nothing, but I knew. He understood. The conversation shifted from casual to razor sharp. Trump continued, this time about G20 in Hamburg, 2017. One evening, after hours of meetings, it was just me and Putin at dinner. No translators, no advisors, just wine and steak. He looked at me, nodded, and said, "I agree to cooperate, but you have to give me something first." You hear that? Not a demand. He set the board. He never lays it out. He makes you offer first. And in that moment, you're already playing without realizing it. Barron listened intently. Trump let out a low, satisfied chuckle. I told him, "You're a businessman too, Vladimir. You know I don't name my price until I see the goods." And for the first time, I saw him really laugh. Trump's voice dropped as he recalled Singapore 2019, a brief but unforgettable encounter. 15 minutes. He walked in, dark suit, no tie, a simplicity that was deliberate. When we shook hands, he gripped tight, looked straight into my eyes and said, "Donald, you look healthier than last time." Then he added, "I like that." Trump laughed. I told him, "So do I, but I bet I'd still beat you in a game of chess." And he just smiled. No denial, no confirmation. Just that same damn mysterious smile. Barron tilted his head, grinning but never taking his eyes off his father. "You actually challenged him to a chess match?" Donald nodded. "Politics is chess, son, and Putin is a skilled player. But so am I. The thing is, he doesn't play to win. He plays to throw his opponent off balance. And that's what makes him dangerous." Trump paused, gazing toward the window where Mar-a-Lago's golden lights reflected in the glass. "You know, in all our meetings, he never wasted a single word. But every handshake, every glance, those were moves on the board. It wasn't conversation. It was negotiation without words." Barron gave a slow nod. He wasn't just listening anymore. He was learning, absorbing the way his father dissected opponents like a seasoned grandmaster. And in that moment, under the opulent glow of Mar-a-Lago, surrounded by a thick, deliberate silence, he realized those private meetings weren't just historical events. They were living chess games, where confidence, strategy, and pure survival instincts determined who emerged on top. Donald turned back to him. "Putin isn't easy to read, but he respects those who know what they're doing. And you know what keeps me in control?" He leaned forward slightly. "I never walk into a room without knowing my next move." The room fell into a hush. No more words, only the slow ticking of an antique clock on the wall. But in Barron's mind, his father's words still echoed, like the opening moves of a grand strategy, a map to a world he knew sooner or later he'd have to step into. I saw him really laugh. Under the warm glow of the chandelier, golden reflections shimmered across the heavy ebony table in Mar-a-Lago. Barron sat in silence, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on his father. The man who had just told a series of stories that made everything he had ever read in the news suddenly seem insignificant. He was no longer merely curious about the name Vladimir Putin. What he wanted to understand now wasn't just the man, powerful, enigmatic, but how his father, Donald Trump, had looked him in the eye and held his ground. How his father had stepped into rooms filled with pressure and made even the most formidable opponents take notice. How a man could command control, even in silence. Barron picked up his iPad but didn't read. Instead, he looked at his father and asked, not hurriedly, not hesitantly, "Dad, how do you know when you're winning? If someone like Putin never reveals what he's really thinking?" Donald Trump paused for a beat. It was not a simple question, but the complexity of it made him smile. He set his glass of orange juice aside, leaned forward and said, "Son, that's the first lesson for anyone stepping into politics or any game of power. Don't wait for someone to confirm that you're winning. You have to know it from within. You have to sense it in the way the other person starts shifting their strategy, in the way they answer a question you haven't even asked yet." Barron nodded slowly, saying nothing. But in his eyes, something changed. It was no longer just curiosity. It was a flicker of deeper thought, the kind that forms when a young mind begins to see the world not through the lens of headlines, but through the experiences of someone who had lived it. "Dad," he asked again, his voice lower this time, "have you ever doubted yourself? In a meeting like that, Have you ever been unsure of what to say? Trump looked at his son, silent for a few seconds, as if weighing a response that wasn't rehearsed, but real to the core. Of course, he admitted, but I never let that doubt dictate my actions. In the room, I always stay in control, and even when I'm not in control, I make sure the other person thinks I am. He emphasized every word. Politics is theater, and once you step onto that stage, you can never forget your role. Even if you're shaken inside, on the outside, you stay solid as stone. Barron sat quietly for a long time, processing it. Not as a child who nods absent-mindedly, but as someone assembling the pieces of a larger picture. He had always known his father as a man of bold slogans and loud declarations. But tonight, in the quiet of this room, he was learning something deeper. That strength wasn't just in what was said, but in mastering oneself before mastering others. Barron set his iPad down on the table, met his father's gaze, and said, I think you're not just good at chess. You understand people. That's what made Putin take notice. Not because you were loud, but because he knew you couldn't be read. Donald Trump leaned back in his chair, nodding, a flicker of something softer passing over his face. You're smart, Barron. I've known that for a long time. But tonight, you're starting to... You see something not every adult understands, Barron continued. People fear you because they don't know what you'll do next. And that's also why Putin treads carefully. He doesn't like surprises, but you were his biggest one. The room fell into silence. Beyond the glass windows, the ocean breeze swept through, carrying the distant rustle of palm trees. In the soft light reflecting off the ceiling, Barron's face seemed to shift. Not just the youthful ease of a teenager, but the look of someone beginning to ask himself, if one day I were in that position, would I have what it takes? And just as his father had once told him, don't wait for someone to tell you you're strong. Make them realize it before you even know for sure. On what seemed like an ordinary evening, Barron Trump was no longer just an observer. He was beginning to step into the game his father had played, not with pieces on a board, but with every thought, every lesson learned. And perhaps the greatest game Donald Trump had ever played was teaching his son that power doesn't begin with victory. It begins with knowing yourself. Barron remained still, but his mind drifted. Everything his father had just shared about Putin, negotiation, and the power of silence made him think deeper. It was no longer just a story about two leaders, no longer a game of political chess. In that moment, Barron began to see something else: loneliness. Dad, he spoke, slow and measured. With all of it, power, influence, the big meetings, have you ever felt alone? Donald Trump didn't answer right away. He turned to his son with a gaze that held depth, as if Barron had just touched on a layer of emotion he rarely allowed to surface. That question, Trump said quietly, is one no one has ever asked me, except you. He sat back down, leaning slightly forward, his hands clasped as if holding something unseen within his chest. Power, he began, is a gift, but it's also a burden. It gives you a voice, influence, respect, but it takes much away in return. Barron stayed silent, not daring to interrupt. Trump continued, his voice lower, steadier than before. There were nights in the White House, Trump began, when I stood alone in the Oval Office, the garden lights outside barely flickering. Decisions sat waiting on my desk. Decisions that would impact thousands. And I couldn't call anyone to ask, what do you think? Because the moment you do that, you're no longer the one making the decision. He lifted his gaze to Barron, a faint, almost wistful smile crossing his face. That's isolation. No one says it, but every leader understands it. They don't trust, not because they're bad people, but because they can't afford to. A man who has been betrayed even once will never look at anyone the same way again. Barron nodded slightly. He didn't know what to say, but he understood. And more than that, he felt something he hadn't before. Behind the strength his father always projected lay a man who had paid a heavy price for his position. "And were you afraid?" Barron asked, his voice more serious than before. "Afraid to live that way?" Trump shook his head. His expression sharpened, but it wasn't cold. "No, I wasn't afraid, because I understood something. Greatness doesn't come from being loved. It comes from doing what must be done, even when no one understands, even when you're misjudged, even when you stand alone." He paused, his eyes drifting toward the fire in the hearth, its embers glowing in the dimly lit room. Putin understands that. I've seen it in his eyes. That kind of loneliness no one can erase. He controls everything, his country, his military, his media, but he doesn't truly trust anyone. And that, my son, is the price of power. Barron tightened his hands slightly. He had never thought of it that way. To him, power had always seemed like admiration, like a shining force. But now he was beginning to see it differently. That same light could burn if one didn't know how to keep a fire alive within. "So how do you keep from losing yourself?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper against the quiet of the night. Trump turned back to him then, his gaze softer, warmer, but no less resolute. "You need an internal compass, Barron. Something you believe in absolutely. Something that doesn't shift no matter how much the world changes. For me, that's America. It's family. It's instinct. You can be alone. You can be betrayed. But if you have something inside you that never wavers, you'll never be lost." He placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, as if passing down a flame. "Greatness, Barron, isn't about being remembered as great. It's about having the courage to do what others won't, to stand for what you believe is right, even when no one stands with you." In that moment, something stirred deep within Barron's chest. A profound respect for his father, a sense of awe at a depth he had never fully grasped before, and an unspoken realization that one day he too would face these questions, not as a son listening to his father, but as a man standing at the center of his own chessboard. Trump lifted his glass of orange juice once more, taking a slow sip. Then he looked at his son and offered a quiet smile. "Now you understand. Not everyone with power is great, but everyone who is great has stood alone." Just as the air between father and son settled after their conversation about loneliness and the cost of power, the landline phone suddenly rang, slow, deep, and resonant, like a sound from another world. Donald Trump glanced at the screen. A single phrase appeared. "Unknown number." He narrowed his eyes, set his glass of orange juice down, and reached for the receiver. "Donald," a deep voice, thick with an Eastern European accent, came through the line. Clear, concise, and unmistakable. Trump raised an eyebrow but showed no sign of surprise. "Vladimir," he said, resting his elbow on the armrest, "I assume you've been listening to tonight's conversation?" Barron sat up straight, his eyes widening. He barely had time to register his father's subtle nod before Trump switched to speakerphone. The voice on the other end continued, steady, deliberate, laced with unspoken meaning. "I don't usually make unexpected calls, but your son asks interesting questions, and I believe he deserves an answer." In the vast living room of Mar-a-Lago, everything fell into an eerie stillness. Only the faint crackling of the fireplace against the stone wall remained, along with the slow, measured breathing of the three men now caught in a conversation none of them had anticipated. Barron. Trump glanced at his son as if passing him the right to speak. "Barron," he said, "he's listening. Ask what you want to ask." At first, Barron hesitated, but then he stood up, stepped closer, and took a deep breath. Mr. Putin, he said, his voice young yet steady, I just want to know, what do you think of my father? Not as a president, but as a man. A brief silence. Then Putin's voice came through, slower this time, as if carefully choosing his words. Your father is unpredictable, at times too blunt, at times too silent. But I do not underestimate him. On the contrary, I respect him because he is not afraid to say what others won't, and because he understands. In the game of power, the ones who don't step back are the ones who survive. Trump let out a quiet chuckle, his eyes never leaving his son. Did you hear that, Barron? He murmured. That's a compliment from a man who doesn't give them easily. Putin continued, his tone now carrying a different weight, as if something was being suggested. I am considering coming to America, not publicly, not officially. But if I do, I want to meet this boy. I want to understand why you trust him so much. Trump straightened, his expression sharpening, but his eyes gleamed with anticipation. Then come, he said firmly, and you will see, not only is my son ready, but so is America. The call ended with a familiar phrase. I will think about it, Donald. But Trump knew. When Putin said that, it meant things were already in motion. He set the phone down, like a strategist who had just received the opening move from his opponent. Turning to Barron, he gave his son a firm pat on the shoulder, one filled with conviction. You see, this is no longer just a lesson. This is real. Barron remained standing. His breath quickened. He could hardly believe it. Putin had actually called. An unannounced call, a recognition, and a veiled invitation to a meeting unlike any before. And you want me to be there? He asked, his voice still laced with disbelief. Not just be there, Trump replied, but stand beside me, not to observe, but to inherit. Barron remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded, this time without hesitation. Something within him had shifted. It was no longer mere admiration for his father. It was the clear, undeniable sense that he could and should be there. Trump looked at his son, a rare smile crossing his face. Legacy is not what I leave behind when I'm gone. It's what I plant in others, so that when the time comes, they are ready to carry it forward. Barron nodded again. He turned toward the window, where the night cloaked Mar-a-Lago in darkness, yet the soft, warm light still lined the pathways. He knew that if this meeting truly happened, it would mark the beginning of a new chapter. Not just for America, not just for Donald Trump, but for himself. And he would not miss that opportunity. Under the golden glow of Mar-a-Lago, a silent witness to conversations no one else could hear, a greater story was unfolding, not just between two world powers, but between a father and his son. Barron was no longer the boy watching from the sidelines. He had taken his first step onto the grand chessboard of history, and the deepest lesson was not about power, it was about clarity, courage, and the ability to hold one's ground amid the undercurrents of politics. Because to lead, one needs more than intelligence. One needs a heart strong enough to bear solitude, and a will powerful enough not to be swayed by any force.